A major court decision today, one that could become a flashpoint in the already tense relationship between Canada and China, came down. A BC judge has ruled that the extradition trial of Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou can proceed to the next level. Meng's arrest back in December of 2018 sent relations between Canada and China to almost an all-time low. In response to the decision today, China urged Canada to release Meng and, quote, not to go further down the wrong path. For more on the decision and reaction to it, we're joined now by the CBC's Susanna De Silva from outside the courthouse in Vancouver. Hi, Susanna. Tell us a bit more about the verdict. What did the judge say?
Yeah, and as you mentioned, what she has decided today is to allow that extradition process to continue. Not that she will be extradited, but that that process can continue, and it's likely to be a very lengthy process. What she was deciding today was this issue of double criminality. Is what she is charged with in the United States also a crime here in Canada? Now, Meng's lawyers were arguing that it is not. She is, of course, accused in the United States of fraud for allegedly lying to a bank about the involvement of one of Huawei's subsidiaries with Iran that would violate the U.S. sanctions. And her lawyers say, well, that can't be a crime in Canada because Canada does not have those same sanctions against Iran. Now, the Crown, on the other hand, was arguing fraud is fraud. A lie is a lie here in Canada or in the United States. And that is essentially what the judge has agreed with today, saying that Meng's lawyers' arguments were too narrow. And in her judgment, saying that would essentially seriously limit Canada's ability to fulfill its international obligations in the extradition context, and that the idea of fraud and the crime of fraud has a vast potential scope and a wide range of conduct. Now, the justice also dealt with the issue that would Canada then essentially be enforcing U.S. sanctions? And she to that said that the idea of economic sanctions is not contrary to Canadian values, and that it can be used in the context of this case. Now, that is a big blow to Meng, who did on the weekend take photos here on these steps behind me in what appear to be victory photos. And CBC spoke with a vice president of Huawei today about what this means for her.
Look, we have confidence in the independence of Canada's judiciary. We have confidence in the rule of law here in Canada, and because of that confidence, we're confident that Meng Wanzhou will be vindicated. But as to the timing of that process, we don't know. But we know that what transpired today is just an early step in what's likely to be a very long process here in Canada.
So you heard Mr. Velshi there mention a long process. What might that process look like?
Yeah, likely to be a very long process with a variety of hearings. Of course, her team can appeal today's decision. There also has to be decided the issue of crime itself. Was there a crime actually committed? Is there enough evidence of this fraud as the U.S. Alleges? That has to be decided. There's also a separate issue. Her lawyers argue that her rights were fundamentally violated when she was arrested. She was held for hours, that they were just trying to get access to her phone and computer. So that issue also has to be dealt with. And the justice also took note that in this process, the final process of extradition, it allows the federal justice minister to intervene and not allow it to happen if it goes contrary to Canadian values. So a lengthy process, and the Chinese embassy has already reacted to this today, releasing a statement saying they believe Canada and the U.S. have gravely violated the lawful rights and interests of the said Chinese citizen. The purpose of the United States is to bring down Huawei and other Chinese high-tech companies, and Canada has been acting in the process as an accomplice of the United States. The whole case is entirely a grave political incident, and we once again urge Canada to take China's solemn position and concerns seriously, and to immediately release Ms. Meng Wanzhou, to allow her to return safely to China and not to go further down the wrong path. So clearly now a lot of questions about what this means for the relationship between Canada and China.
And we're going to look to try and answer some of those. Thanks, Susanna. I really appreciate the update. The CBC's Susanna De Silva in Vancouver. So how should we expect China to respond to this decision, and what does it mean for detained Canadians Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor? I want to bring in Guy Saint-Jacques. He served as Canada's ambassador to China from 2012 to 2016. He's now a senior fellow at the University of Alberta's China Institute and joins us from Montreal. Hi, Mr. Saint-Jacques. Good to see you again, as always.
Good to see you.
Right before our show went to air, we got a statement from the Chinese embassy here in Ottawa, and I want to read part of it to you and get you to help us interpret it. The United States and Canada, they write, by abusing their bilateral extradition treaty and arbitrarily taking forceful measures against Ms. Meng Wanzhou, gravely violated the lawful rights and interests of the said Chinese citizen. The purpose of the U.S. is to bring down Huawei and other Chinese high-tech companies, and Canada has been acting in the process as an accomplice of the U.S. The whole case is entirely a grave political incident. What does that tell us about how China is interpreting what happened today?
Well, I think it's consistent with what we have heard in the past, and it's also in line with the threat made by the spokesperson for the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Zhao Lijian, earlier today, that if Mrs. Meng was not freed, there would be consequences for Canada. It also confirms that China does not want to understand how rule of law works, and I recall when I was ambassador, and we had the case of Kevin Garrett. Once he was put to trial, they told us, "Don't ask us to interfere in a judicial process. Don't you understand that we have rule of law in China?" But I would add that last year Xi Jinping said that the Communist Party of China is above the law, and the judiciary process must report to the political system. So all this to say that they expect that the Prime Minister will pick up the phone and tell the judge to free Mrs. Meng. And of course, this is not going to happen.
I interviewed the Defense Minister, Harjit Sajjan, earlier in the show, as well as we've heard the Prime Minister being asked about this the past few weeks. And they were pretty specific in saying, and this was the line that I heard most often, our judicial system is independent, it's separate from the political system, and they don't understand that in China. What do you think of that approach?
Well, I think they are right. And of course, on this issue, China speaks on both sides of its mouth, because let's recall that they wanted to have an extradition treaty with Canada. They wanted to use that to shorten the time to repatriate economic fugitives. But of course, they were not going to help us when Kevin Garrett was detained. That was another example of hostage diplomacy. In this case, of course, we have no leverage to speak of that we can exercise with China. And now that the Chinese know that the extradition process of Mrs. Meng will go on for years, I think they will decide to take further measures against Canada, both on the commercial front, but also with regard, unfortunately, to Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor.
Yeah, that's exactly what I wanted to ask you. What do you anticipate from China as far as the possibility of retaliation is concerned? When you talk about the commercial front, for example, we know that they've already targeted canola in the past. Do you anticipate more of that? And with Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, what are you anticipating there?
Yeah, well, on the commercial front, let's recall that we lost $4.5 billion in export to China last year. In the first 3 months of this year, our exports are down 16%. And I don't think that they would cut the medical supplies to them, because that would generate such a opprobrium internationally. I think it's something that they will refrain from doing, and neither will they cut our pork exports, because they are too dependent and they have lost too many pigs. But there are a number of other contracts that they could cancel. Also, they are under pressure to buy as much as they can from the United States under the Phase 1 deal. And so we are going to lose traditional market shares. With regard to our two Canadians, unfortunately, I think the next step is that they will make an announcement, possibly as early as tomorrow, because in terms of timing, this decision it's not the best, in as much as the National People's Congress is sitting in Beijing. The session is ending tomorrow. Xi Jinping will want to appear strong and will want to make to be seen as acting against Canada, and therefore I suspect that they will announce that our two Canadians will go to trial. And we know in the Chinese system, once you are accused, you are found guilty 99.9% of the time.
So help us understand, based on your experience, what might be happening behind the scenes. I know you talk about a lack of leverage, but what efforts should and could the Canadian government be making right now?
Well, I think that, the demarches should be made by Ambassador Barton in Beijing to explain once again how the judicial process works in Canada, that it's separate from the political process, that even if the Chinese were to cut our exports to zero, still there is no way that the Prime Minister can intervene in this case. But also, I think we are at the stage where the federal government has to reassess its strategy with dealing with China. I would call this an appeasement strategy because we have been very mild in our criticism of what has been happening in Xinjiang or what's happening in Hong Kong, the way that China has mishandled the COVID-19 pandemic. I think on one end we have to adopt a much firmer tone, but also we have to continue to work with allies to ask them to continue to put pressure on China to free our two Canadians. Also to work together to try to reinforce the multilateral system to make sure that rules apply equally to all. And the last point is to try to put more pressure on Donald Trump to help us more, because the United States is the only country that can put pressure on China. And on that, he has to be a lot more forceful, going even to the point of making threats to China. But unfortunately, I don't think that he will do that.
Yeah, I was going to say, even in the past few months throughout this, at least the more recent part of this pandemic, he certainly has increased the anti-China rhetoric where the outbreak is concerned, where the virus is concerned. I'm wondering what you think about the possibility of, I guess, him looping all of this into that, or being seized at all with this Canadian issue?
Well, he knows that the sanctions that have been applied against China have created a lot of damage on the economic front, despite the fact that China is recovering from the pandemic. Still, their unemployment rate is still very high. And with the world market being in the doldrums, they know that it will take time to get out of that. And so, of course, Mr. Trump will want to run on an anti-China platform. He did that partly in the previous one. Now, of course, he has more ammunition. But it's a question, does he want to help a friend? And so far, I don't think that he has helped anyone around the world. It's America first, and this is very unfortunate.
What's your gauge, or what's your assessment of the international reaction or the international efforts outside of the United States? And I ask because in previous conversations with you, there was a time where the efforts were being made to sort of coalesce a group of countries, get them together and amp up the pressure on China. And there were statements being made by other countries. But that, of course, has now fallen to the background when everyone's dealing with this pandemic.
Well, I think this has been a successful strategy. It has paid off. And I think it should continue. It has taken China by surprise. They were not expecting this. And I would say that their image started to deteriorate on the international scene with the arrest of the two Michaels. It has continued once people started to learn more about what was going on in Xinjiang, what's going on, of course, in Hong Kong, but also in the way that China has mishandled the COVID-19 crisis. We see also Chinese diplomats being a lot more aggressive. All of this is not serving the interests of China, as we have heard from Ambassador Barton himself.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Saint-Jacques. Appreciate your time as always.
Thank you very much.
David Mulroney served as Canada's ambassador to China from 2009 to 2012. He's now a distinguished fellow at the University of Toronto's Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. He joins us from Toronto. Hi, Mr. Mulroney. Good to see you again. Thank you for making time for us.
Good to be with you, Mashi.
I wanted to read for you a little bit of, and for our audience, what the embassy has put out in response to this decision. And I believe we have a board here that I can pull up so people can read along with me. The United States and Canada, by abusing their bilateral extradition treaty and arbitrarily taking forceful measures against Ms. Meng Wanzhou, gravely violated the lawful rights and interests of the said Chinese citizen. The purpose of the U.S. is to bring down Huawei and other Chinese high-tech companies, and Canada has been acting in the process as an accomplice of the U.S. The whole case is entirely a grave political incident. The release goes on to say, or the embassy goes on to say, we once again urge Canada to take China's solemn position and concerns seriously, immediately release Ms. Meng Wanzhou to allow her to return safely to China. What is your interpretation, and how should we interpret what I just read from China's embassy?
I think that is to be expected. The Chinese are furious. And what they're doing is part of what they're doing to Canada and Australia right now, because, of course, Australia is in their bad books for asking for an objective review of the World Health Organization. So they're saying both countries are carrying water for the United States, that we're vassals of the United States. And I think, in fact, Minister Champagne issued a very short release after the decision, and he very wisely pointed to the decision itself. I've read it now. It's very carefully argued, and it makes it very clear that this is not something that we're doing at the behest of the United States. It's a carefully reasoned legal decision.
Yeah, I'll read a little bit of that statement that you just referenced from François-Philippe Champagne, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs. The decision is but one component in a multi-step legal process. The government of Canada will continue to be transparent about the extradition process for Ms. Meng. Today's decision on double criminality in Meng Wanzhou's extradition process was an independent decision of the Supreme Court of British Columbia. And we have heard frequently, including from the Minister of Defense, whom I just interviewed, the government repeatedly sort of talk about the fact that the process here in Canada, the judicial process at least, is free from political interference. And in fact, the Prime Minister, I think a few weeks ago, even said, and has repeated a few times since, that China doesn't understand that. Do you think that's a fair statement?
I'm not sure that it's entirely accurate. I think a lot of people in China don't understand it, but Chinese diplomats absolutely understand how Canada works. They're just choosing not to acknowledge it. And I must say that, if people in China itself are confused, we gave them good reason to be confused after the unfortunate Ambassador McCallum gaffes, after statements by very high-placed Canadians that there should be a prisoner exchange. So we haven't helped our own case, but I think today's ruling makes clear that this is in the hands of a judge, and that Ms. Meng, by the way, had a legal team that Canadians could only dream to have if they could afford it. I mean, she's being given every opportunity to tell her story. Unfortunately, as this continues, two Canadians bear the brunt of it, and that's Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor and their families. So our hearts go out to them, because I think this means that their unfair detention in China will continue for some time.
That's exactly what I wanted to ask you next. And of course, those two Canadians, Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor, their pictures are up on the screen right now. They have been detained for more than 500 days in China. They have not, since the outset of this pandemic, even had access to consular visits. What do you anticipate, or what should we anticipate China's reaction to this to be? What will they be retaliatory?
What China has done is created what I've called a parody of the Canadian process. So every time we've reached a decision point or done something in the Meng case, they have matched it with their own fake process that they're imposing on the two Michaels. And I'm afraid that we're going to see more of the same, that they will now perhaps proceed with some form of prosecution of the Michaels for the spurious national security charges that have been brought against them. And this is the real tragedy at the heart of this.
We know they've also retaliated in the past commercially, for example, where canola is concerned. Do you anticipate that kind of reaction this time too?
That could happen, and there's already been a little bit of noise coming out of China from places like the state-run or the state-influenced Global Times, which is their kind of most radical newspaper about that. But a couple of things to consider. One, Canadians have had a year and a half to get used to Chinese bullying, and although it always hurts, and it hurts in some sectors more than others, the effect begins to lessen over time. The other thing is that, as you mentioned in referring to Hong Kong, China has its hands full right now. It's got a major problem with the United States with this decision to really rule that Hong Kong is no longer autonomous and therefore subject to the kind of trade restrictions that China itself faces. They're being criticized, as they should be, for the terrible things they're doing in the far west in Xinjiang. They've got the fallout from the pandemic that they're still dealing with, and Australia is taking the brunt of the abuse from China on that. And they're also involved in a very serious military standoff with the Indians in the remote passes of the disputed territory that they share up in the Himalayas. So normally China, if it's got a problem with one country like the United States, it tries to make good with others. President Xi, through his aggression, has got his hands full.
So let me ask you, how should that inform, or how might that inform Canada's reaction to this going forward? Like, what would your advice be to the federal government now, who has, been the subject of some criticism for some of the positions it has taken, or the lack of clarity in those positions, where China is concerned?
And I think that criticism has been deserved. As I said today, just to be fair, I think the Minister Champagne's statement was exactly what should be said. And the key there, and where we've missed in the past, is we've substituted flattery and sort of obsequious language for the facts. We don't need to bait China. We don't need to attack China, but we simply need to describe things as they are. Hong Kong is a good case in point. Canadians fought and died for Hong Kong in World War II. We've grown rich off the brains and hard work of people from Hong Kong in our country. And we pledged our support for the 1997 agreement and the 1997 handover because it promised autonomy to the people of Hong Kong. If we're not forthright in calling for China to stop reneging on the deal, we're failing Hong Kong, we're failing our own history as well.
I only have a minute left, Mr. Mulroney, but the government has often, and even Minister Sajjan, whom I just put some of those questions to, often talks about sort of the delicate dance that they have to play right now because of the amount, for example, of even medical supplies coming from China that we depend on, and some of the retaliatory measures that they've taken before. How would you address those concerns?
I'd say, and it pains me as a former Canadian diplomat to say this, look at what Australia is doing. Australia is far more dependent on China than we are economically, but they're taking a lead in working with middle powers to seek the answers that we deserve on what happened in the pandemic and how the World Health Organization handled things. We need to summon up our courage. It never pays to flatter China, to play up to China. We can speak honestly and frankly. And I hope starting today, this is the beginning of that change in Canadian policy.
Okay, I'll leave it there. Thank you, as always, for your insights this evening, Mr. Mulroney. Pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you, Vashi.
David Mulroney was Canada's ambassador to China from 2009 to 2012. A BC judge has ruled the extradition process against Huawei executive Meng Wanzhou will continue.
I can say that we are extremely proud the independence of our judicial system, and that's what our democracy is about. And our courts have made a decision, and they'll be completely independent from anyone. And I want to also take this opportunity to ask for the immediate release of our two Michaels who have been kept in jail for an extremely long time.
That is Canada's Minister of National Defence, Harjit Sajjan, from a bit earlier on the show, calling for the release of two Canadians detained in China, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. There they are. They've been there for more than 500 days, detained for more than 500 days. Today's ruling in the BC court on so-called double criminality, which refers to the alleged crime being a crime in both countries involved, means Meng's case will not be dismissed. So what does that mean for the already strained relationship between Canada and China? And what might it mean for Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, those two Canadians we were just discussing? Time for the Power Panel to weigh in. Over in Toronto, Amanda Alvaro of Pomp and Circumstance. Summa Strategies' Tim Powers is in Ottawa, as is Kathleen Monk of Earnscliffe Strategy Group. Hey guys, great to see you.
Oh.
Amanda, I'm going to start with you. How much of an impact do you think this has on what is already, a tough relationship?
I think that it will continue to have the impact that it's had. I mean, from Canadian exporters who have found delays, unprecedented delays and cancellations in their dealings with China, to what the minister described as the top priority. And you'll hear that echoed amongst, I'm sure, any cabinet member that's discussing this topic today, and that is the two Michaels. The fact that they've been detained for over 500 days. And you can imagine when this decision comes down, and of course it's completely independent, but you can imagine the anxiety and the trauma that their families are experiencing as they think about what kind of retaliation may be marked for them. So certainly I thought it was interesting that the first statement out of the minister's office, out of the Foreign Affairs Minister's office today, referenced the two Michaels, talked about their immediate release, talking about the fact that they've been detained, and of course, all Canadians, as they watch this decision come down, that is the top priority. That is the biggest concern.
Yeah, and to be fair, the Minister of National Defense right away used it, answered the question quickly and then said, I'm using this opportunity to call for the release of Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig. That statement that Amanda refers to, Tim, from François-Philippe Champagne, the Minister of Foreign Affairs, also reiterates what we've heard, and I think we were talking about maybe even last week or the week before with the three of you, insofar as the federal government very clearly saying our judicial system is independent of the political system or of political interference. You might not get that, but that's what happened today.
Let me go to Champagne in a second. First of all, and I'll never get invited on Chinese state TV again when I say this, but what a stupid publicity stunt by Meng Wanzhou's team on Saturday. Why in the world they did that? Didn't help them. I think that moved public opinion against them. On Mr. Champagne and the Canadian government, I'm sure, Vashi, they're also breathing a sigh of relief for two reasons. One, I think what Justice Holmes did was important and right. Had she gone and supported the Meng Wanzhou's legal team and agreed with their argument, she would have undone in her decision long established precedents on extradition and treaties and judicial procedures that govern them. So good for her on not doing that. Secondly, the government would have been in a tough place if this had been undone. Would they have appealed the process? There would have been calls from the United States for them to appeal the process. There would have been a bigger diplomatic problem. So they're very fortunate. I'm sure Minister Champagne is breathing a sigh of relief. This doesn't release the two Michaels. It probably makes it harder, unfortunately, for them to get released, but it was the right decision.
I just want to pull up what you were referring to off the top there. If the control room doesn't mind, if you can swing back to that loop of pictures of Miss Meng over the weekend, who was making peace signs, and CBC was able to see her on the front steps of the courthouse there. You can see those pictures there. That's what Tim was referring to. A very odd scene, unexpected, I think maybe it's fair of me to say. Kathleen, what do you think about the outcome today and the potential impact as we take a look at those pictures?
Yeah, I mean, that picture particularly, I think that was Meng trying to say it's going to be case closed. This saga will be over. I will return to life as normal. And in fact, what happened with Justice Holmes' decision today is that it actually was just another step in the process, and we'll just continue and go forward. I think what comes out of this decision today from Justice Holmes is really three primary things, being, that there's going to be probably severe economic repercussions put on Canada. There will, I hope not, and I pray not, that there won't be any repercussions to the hostages, to the two Michaels. And then, of course, there's going to be other more practical challenges that will be presented by this decision and China's obvious anger, and that will be potentially curtailing some of our needs in terms of accessing PPE from the country, which the government of Canada has been trying to do and has been bringing over quite a bit since this COVID crisis. The last thing I just point out is just the political stuff, right? Because that's, where the three of us as political pundits reside, and the interest lies there. And we're seeing a lot of really interesting things happening on that level, specifically when you saw Pompeo today in the States indicate that he was thinking of retracting both the financial and the preferential treatment and the trade treatment that Hong Kong gets as a result of recent security moves that China has made within on Hong Kong. And so that is going to be also another body blow to China, and it's not going to play out well.
Yeah, let's talk about the politics of all of that, Amanda, for a bit, because that is why I love to talk to the three of you. It's a domestic issue too, right? This is an issue that the Conservatives go very hard on the Liberals for, but they keep telling us and they keep reminding us of the fact that, just like Kathleen says, there's a ton of PPE right now that we need to get from China. They've hit us hard on our exports from farmers, canola farmers, for example. examples in the past, and there are those two Michaels. How does the government navigate this politically, Amanda?
Yeah, and this is what we were, I was talking about from the get-go. It's this awful balancing act, this tightrope that the government has to walk in the diplomatic relationships with China, how to maintain for the business relationship, for the export and trade relationships, not just canola and meat, but many businesses described what I said earlier, unprecedented delays, cancellations of their orders. Then we have the protective equipment. Like there are layers upon layers of issues. And then sort of at the top, the most important and pressing, the issue that's paramount to the government and also to all Canadians is the release of the two Michaels. So having to navigate all of that while this independent legal process is going off with a full core press effort, communications effort from Meng's team. And they've made their share of missteps, whether it's the photo op that occurred over the weekend, or whether it's the op-ed that she wrote, or open letter that she wrote many months ago that described, her challenges. I think they've just continued to shred any kind of consideration that Canadians might have for her particular well-being as well.
And Tim, we have really seen, and I'm sure you might have seen this up close too in some of your data, but the public opinion of Canadians towards China on this specific measure, but even more widely, has it's shifted a lot. And it was already not great, but it's really bad right now.
Yeah, it's not great, nor should it be. I don't think China really, other than perhaps sending the PPE that Canadian businesses buy over there and letting it come to Canada, has done any favors for us. But to your question to Amanda, you're talking about the NHL earlier and perhaps them having a game in Edmonton. Well, that great Edmonton hockey player, Wayne Gretzky, said he knew where the puck was going to go, and Canada does too. And I think they telegraphed this recently. The debate is going to be about China and the World Health Organization. And I think Canada has the opportunity, as Ambassador Barton seemed to seize upon a couple of weeks ago, to go after China that way. I think there are different allies that will come to greater agreement around how China may or may not have influenced the World Health Organization in this pandemic. And that may begin to put some pressure on China to think about how it behaves with other countries, because we will not be able to do this alone. We need to be firm and strong, as your interview with Prime Minister Turnbull says, but we have to use other points of leverage, and it may be an investigation around the World Health Organization.
Kathleen, what do you think about that as far as the political question goes?
I think that interview with Turnbull is, must-watch viewing for everyone. So there's a plug, Vashi. But I thought it was incredible. And it's that idea that we need as Canadians to work with other middle powers across the globe to speak frankly and truthfully, factually to China, and that's why I thought his strategy was so important. I also think that the Trudeau government, beyond doing what Tim just mentioned in terms of work around the World Health Organization, possibly needs to show a sign of strength or a show of force around Taiwan, and possibly supporting Hong Kong as well in some ways.
Do you think, Amanda, the pressure, what is your sense, I guess, of the conversations behind the scenes around, for example, Hong Kong or Taiwan? Because the Hong Kong question, let's say, for example, I had Mr. Sajjan on. I was asking, are you going to follow suit with the U.S.? They have expressed concern, a high degree of concern with their allies, the UK and Australia, but so far have not gone as far as the U.S. And the U.S. has its own domestic political considerations that I should be fair and point out as well. But what kind of pressure do you think the feds are up against, and what is the conversation like behind the scenes, do you imagine?
Well, and you've just pointed out the exact, challenge. There is the kind of statement that they can put out with their allies, with the UK, with Australia, to talk about Hong Kong. Going beyond that, though, it's like taking apart all of these other issues and layers that are building upon each other. And the one other thing that I wanted to mention is, as we have these conversations about China, about COVID, about WHO, we're also seeing something else happen on Canadian soil, and that's retaliation against Asian Canadians and Chinese Canadians. So there's that another layer, this
which
like
is
kind
awful,
of insidious layer that's occurring awful degree of violence and racism that has emerged. And we're seeing not just one incident, but many, many incidents. So I think the government also has to play this role of dealing with the diplomatic relationship with China, dealing with the business issues, the trade issues that are at hand, dealing with the hostages, and then, of course, on Canadian soil, protecting Asian Canadians and making sure that as all of this bubbles up and becomes and continues to become a global conversation, that there isn't retaliation on our soil against our own Canadian people.
And we have heard the federal government and various provincial governments, thank goodness, denounce that, which is awful and totally wrong. And I'm glad you brought that up, Amanda. I do have to leave it there, though. We're out of time. Thanks to all three of you for your time tonight. Great to see you as always. Amanda Alvaro, Tim Powers, and Kathleen Monk, our Power panel this evening. Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.